Well, Rik, can we just start off with just an introduction, who you are?
I'm Rik Caulder. I'm approaching 75. I worked with Derek from the 60s, early 60s, then went into television, eventually became a freelance cameraman, travelled the world, enjoyed it at other people's expense. Now I have to pay to travel.
I wonder if you can tell us how you came to be working for Derek Evans, and if you could give us dates. And,
Okay. I think it was 1960 and I was still at grammar school in Worcester, actually. It might have been 59. And I decided to leave school prior to the time I was supposed to, and went home and told my folks I'd left school. They were slightly surprised, but fortunately for them and me, a man who lived around the corner ran a pub. He took photographs of very pretty England, black and white, big pictures, half-page spread on the back of the Times. Adverts were on the front in those days, and it was the big paper. So he suggested to my folks there'd been an advert in the Burrows Journal or the Worcester Evening News of an advert wanting a photographer to train up in Hereford. So he presumed it was for the Hereford Evening News or the Citizen. So he made the phone call. My father drove me down into snow and ice in January to meet up with Derek Evans. Obviously, I'd never heard of him, and I didn't understand press agencies or anything in those days. And I had an interview which I remember nothing about. I remember driving back to Worcester with my father driving back to Worcester. And then I think we phoned up and I got the job, and I think I started on a Monday or a Tuesday, and then 2 days later I ended up doing a picture for The Guardian of beating the bounds, which was the most dreadful picture I've ever taken. It was almost in focus, but Evans managed to sell it because he was a supreme salesman.
So tell us about what was it like working for the Derek Evans studio, and who else were you working with?
I was fortunate enough because I was the very junior and the youngest, obviously. And Mike Charity had been there, I think, 2 or 3 years by the time I ended up climbing the stairs to the office in, is it Edgar Street, I think it is, next to the Green Dragon. I was pretty fit in those days. If I tried those stairs now, I'd probably be out of breath. Anyway, it was lovely, and you quickly got thrown in. As I say, within 2 days I had a picture in The Guardian, but you were given a camera, told what to do, and we'd read the papers avidly every day. We'd watch what little television news was. It was just beginning, and diary events, herd book, markets, anything that was going on. Could we make a picture out of it? And so we'd get sent off to do those jobs, and sometimes I'd go with Derek, or much more often I'd go with Mike, and we'd use 2 cameras and do pictures for the Nationals or for regional or Birmingham papers. It sort of began there, really. And then eventually, when I was able to drive, and I wasn't able to drive for the first year and a half I was there, you'd get sent off on your own to do stuff, and enjoyed doing it, really. You got to travel, got to meet people, which is my bag. All my mates say to me, "Why did you never do natural history?" And I'm going, well, you can't talk to animals. And I enjoy people. And I think that's why I've enjoyed the job so much, really. And it was all thanks to Mr. Evans, as they call him.
I mean, because we've heard a lot about Derek, and that he was a real people person, and that he managed to work this huge network of contacts. I wonder if that's something you learned from him.
It's difficult to say that. You just pick up all that stuff naturally as you make more and more people. Your filofax or your whatever becomes thicker and thicker. And just like when I was travelling the world, obviously I made contacts all over the world, and the people I travelled with in the military or within government circles or with journalists and whatever, you got to know. And he did, and he did have some good contacts. But he was also, imagine Hereford, in a way it was quite a small place. So he would know virtually everybody in the city, wouldn't he? The religion, club people, all sorts. I think he was a member of Rotary. I can't remember. I don't think he was a member of any other closed club or anything like that. But he knew if you walk down the street with him, that he'd know virtually everybody as you wandered down the street. So all of that is it teaches you to respect people, and you make decisions very quickly about people when you're a photographer or a cameraman. Sometimes you get it horribly wrong. But normally you can assess they're going to be nice to you, they're going to help you. Do you do this? Do you do that? Sort of stuff,
You were telling, who was another cameraman, he said one of the biggest lessons Derek ever taught him was to not always look at where the main action was.
Yeah.
Look to the side or look behind you. And you were telling us a lovely story about going to photograph cricket at Worcester.
Yeah.
I just wondered, what sort of lessons did you pick up or learn from Derek?
Well, I think you could go through Derek's pictures, and if you were in the utility or the toilet room of the offices, there were pictures everywhere. Michael used to take a book in there and read it, and he could be some while. But I'd go through all the old pictures and you'd go, oh, I didn't see that, and that so-and-so must have done that or whatever. And the whole place was lined with stuff that had gone into the newspapers or disappeared. But you realise very quickly, and I just, the whole snapping business, as I call it, because I'm now not a snapper and I was a cameraman in television, you very quickly realise everybody's jostling for the same picture, and you go, what is the point? There's no point in that, because the agency is going to have the picture, it's going to spread it everywhere. You've got to find something, what I call off the ball, and you have to, sometimes I think you suggested, you have to look behind you. And I was sent to Worcester cricket ground to do some important cricket match. I was never much into the sport, but I really enjoyed filming and photographing sport, which I did masses of. Anyway, I got, and everybody had done the picture, Worcester Cathedral, the match in the foreground, idyllic, classic for the back page of the Sunday Times or the half page of the Times. Anyway, so I looked behind, and all of a sudden I could see this bowler who was already famous, but became much more famous in taking 7 wickets on this particular match. And he had a cricket ball, and he's like pinching into it, and he's got it, and it's in front of his eye and whatever. And I sold the Sunday Times, I think it was 6 pictures in a row. They were only tiny. And, it just shows you that you sometimes have to look outside the box. And sometimes you get it wrong. Sometimes you gamble that you don't need to be where all the mob snappers are, and you can go somewhere else. But sometimes you might miss the most important shot. Fortunately, it only happened to me once, so that's fine. So there, I think it is. And Derek would always be outside the box when possible,
So, when it came to selling photographs, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we got one of the things about marketing all the agency's pictures. It was done in 2, if not 3 ways. You either got commission, told to go and photograph something, and there'd be picture editors who were well defined, knew exactly what they thought they were going to see. They weren't ever there, but in their mind, they conjured up the picture. They knew which part of the page it would go on. So that was one side of it. So you were tempted to pander to them, meanwhile probably doing other stuff as well and thinking, oh, that's much better. Or we'd go, as I say, go through the papers, we'd know what was going on locally, and off we'd go with either a film camera or still camera and take incidents or stuff going on. You think, oh, visually that's lovely, the light might be perfect. And then you'd have to market it. I was hopeless at it, hopeless. I really struggled in writing the captions. Evans was brilliant, Mike Charity even better, and Evans could sell a picture on a caption. So he'd written the caption, the picture was being printed up for him, and he's selling it, having written the caption before the picture's even in his hands. He'd seen it. And so he would market it. And I was I was pretty hopeless at that, and talking to the picture editors and marketing. After a while, they get used to it, and you know you're not going to bother. They know you're not going to bother them unless it's worth their while. You know.
I have to say, some of the headlines in the clippings file are fantastic.
Yeah.
There's one of sorry, this is an aside, but
Yeah.
the first 2 police women in Ross, and the headline is "Arrest me, oh please do."
Yeah. Brilliant. That must have been well after my time.
Early 70s, isn't it?
Yeah.
But you were talking about when when there was an urgent demand for a photograph, so
Yeah.
they would send down the van to
Yeah.
outside the GPO.
Well,
Can you kind of paint that scenario?
Yes.
If that one occasion.
Yeah. I mean, technology has moved on so quickly, and it's left me behind, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I started on bits of film and glass negatives, and then suddenly we're into film, we're into video and all that. But in the early days of the agency, if there was a major story, and I think it may have only happened about half a dozen times, they'd send a wire machine down to the post office in Edgar Street, the main post office, the technical post office, and telephones, of course. They were all one thing in those days. And this truck, I think it was a Humber Hawk, a big thing, would drive in with an engineer, and he'd hook up on a landline and the power, and then you'd print up this picture with a big white border on it, and it went on almost like a cylinder player, an old cylinder player. Most people won't know what that is, of course, these days. That's an early gramophone. And it goes on this machine, it cycles, and there's a scanner goes along it. And sometimes they get quite good quality out of them. And so the picture would end up at a receiving machine in London. And sometimes the quality was reasonable. You could almost see what was going on in the picture. But that wasn't a regular occurrence. Normally we'd have to do the caption, stick it to the back of the picture in an envelope, red star to London, Birmingham, Cardiff, wherever, Manchester. And the same with all the film, with the 16mm film tins, of which you could never use more than 100 foot, 2 minutes 40 seconds, unless you were doing sport, and then you were allowed to use a little more. But the technology has just gone bonkers, hasn't it? I mean, it has passed me by.
What about competition for a story in the city?
Well, there were 3 newspapers: the glorious Gloucester Citizen, the Hereford Evening News, and the Hereford Times. There would be slight competition, but it was very amicable. I never ever to this day managed to get a very large flashbulb to go off at events, big events with loads of people in a room that was not lit. And so I would get sent the next day to a lovely, lovely man called Gough Johnson, who would kindly let me have a print, and I'd apologise profusely, saying, one day I'll get one of these damn flashbulbs. You had to lick them and push them down into the holder, and it was not unknown for the damn things to go off in your hand, and they're lethal. You know, they've got I forget what chemical metal inside, where it would just flash, and it's like an explosion. Anyway, he used to laugh every time, and then he and I always did the bull sales and that, and he was as meticulous as the bull wanted to be, and moving it around. So we did work really well together. And then there was a Barry somebody or other at the Hereford Evening News, Griffiths, that's him. He was nice. We all worked well together. There weren't too many people to get in the way till the London mob came down. And the worst scenario I remember was, I don't know whether you've seen the stuff about Michael Foot, who had a major crash just outside Monmouth and Simonjat on the, and the story went that he and his wife, who was a journalist on the Daily Mirror, they were rescued from the vehicle, but they had a baby, and the baby was still in the car, and they took the mum and dad off to the hospital, and they had to go back for the baby. So there's this brilliant but almost disastrous story unfolding. And Michael was in hospital for a long, long time. And all of a sudden, we had the nod. And suddenly, journos from London, from Fleet Streets, were down, up, big boots on the stairs, coming up to the office. Evans goes, "It's time for you two to get down to the hospital." So Mike, I think it was Mike and I, went down and I said, "I'm doing stills on this, you can do film." Because you were quite excited to make your scrapbook up. Rather than, because of film, you could make a note of what you'd done, but you'd never have visual remembrance of it, unlike today. And so they came. I remember there was 2 journos and a couple of photographers turned up in the office. So we're going down. They go, "Oh, where are you going?" We're going, "Oh, we got some, just some stuff to do for the local newspaper stuff, So we went, and I was at the back of the ambulance, and I knew I was on the right trail because it was a London ambulance. So I had to be, you were aware of all the things that could happen, whatever. And so they opened the back of the ambulance, and I can't remember whether he was getting in or she was getting in, and he gave her, it was either a bracelet or a ring, and I remember snapping that. That made every national, of course. Evans was quite pleased, and Mike Charity filmed it. I'm pretty sure it was Mike. I don't think it was Keith, but it's just one of those silly little tales. But that's when it became competitive, but it was never that fiery on the ground. I mean, we did park a few cars when prisoners were being taken into court, so they had to go a different way and things like that. So sort of thing happens every day now. Okay, well, big source of the material that we would do or sell would be to do with police incidents, murders, whatever. And I know Herefordshire's had its few or many, and so the only way you could photograph them, and the buildings were never made for vehicles to go into, so they always had to drag the culprit or the suggested culprit out of the vehicle and walk them into the court. But you could never quite make sure you were there at that moment, and on occasions there were some side streets around where the police station and the courts were, and for them you had to get them arriving in a particular way to make it easier. So you'd park a car and leave it there for a bit, or get someone to just be in it. So the driver of the prison van would have to, or the police van would have to do a little bit of a detour. And so that was a bit of fun. I'm sure the cops realised we were at it. There was one horrible murder, wasn't there? Was it a doctor, and somebody came in, and one of his patients who had spots or something. Is that right? I don't know. I can't remember. But he murdered the doctor. He came in and knifed the doctor. That went on a bit. That was a pretty horrible tale. And I remember being sent to Ledbury, lovely place, and there was a magistrate's court there, and there's a woman up for murder. But she was out on bail. It was the weirdest tale. And I can't remember what she'd done. She'd murdered somebody, but, possibly an accident. But anyway, this person had died and whatever. And you didn't, in those days, we were not that savvy at snapping people as they rushed up the street or did whatever. And I just went up to her and I said, "Look, I'm sorry, I'm from Hereford, a press agency. Could I just take a picture of you? Would you mind?" And she's standing outside the court with some relatives, and I think they were sort of quite heavy characters standing with her, but they, because I was down here and pretending to be small, that she said, "Well, if you buy me fish and chips, you can take my picture." So I thought, oh, nice one. And quite often, as I've learnt in life, never be late. Never, ever be late. Too many of my colleagues end up being late. And I've turned up to things in television terms. And there'd be a couple of PR blokes or someone. It was going to be a bit of a staged event. And they said, "Well, it's only you then, is it?" So I'd go, "Yeah, I don't think anybody else will be turning up." So we'd get on ahead of time, 10 minutes to. Then, of course, the other snappers from the Mirror or whatever would turn up and go, "Oh, it's all happened, does it?" We go, "Yeah, guys, you've got to get here on time." So we had a bit of fun like that. But I got a call from the fire brigade, or somebody, maybe the police or whatever. There was a cottage on fire somewhere out in wherever. I can't remember the places. I would remember them 40 years ago, but not now. And I turned up, and I'm there, and there's loads of smoke and a bit of flame coming out of the top of this thatched cottage, beautiful, pretty thatched cottage. And all of a sudden, it got a bit. The wind must have caught up, and in the next minute, the fire engine caught fire. So I'm there, much to the embarrassment of the fire brigade. Of course, I had to do it. I took a couple of stills and made another photo news for the Express or something like that. But just one of those things where you're on location and something happens very different to why you were there, or being part of it. So you learn to adapt as you go along. And the weirdest things happen to you, and you think, was that right? Just happened? And you go, yeah, I think it was. Yeah, we got the picture, so we're fine.
And Derek was happy.
Very happy, peculiarly happy. No, he would always. There was never. I never remember bad moments in that office. I think he was either smoking a cigarette or laughing his head off, and he was a jolly chap. And he had money to be jolly. He had a good income. When I first joined the agency in '60, Derek Evans' father was in and out of the office polishing anything he could. He was a lovely, lovely man. He'd been a miner. Inevitably smoked 700 a day or 20, I'm not sure. And sadly, he did end up contracting cancer. And but he was good. He was good to Mike and I, and he would keep us like young boys under the thumb, sort of thing. And I was privileged because Ted was unwell, and I think he may have even been in hospital. Derek had to go to a photokina in Cologne. And so he said to me, I think it may have been the year that Mike decided to go off to Cheltenham to start his agency. And he said, we're going to Cologne tomorrow. I'm going, oh, that'll be nice, Derek. Yeah, very nice. So where's that? No. So off we went. And it was brilliant. And I've even been back to try and find the hotel. It's called the Hotel Lens. It was just lovely. But we went out on the streets at night, and I photographed very large men with the tiniest of dogs standing on street corners, which is a disturbing image of Cologne in those days. Now, just guys walking their dogs, and they were just the tiny dachshund things, Anyway, during the day, we'd go off to to this big place that has exhibition centre, but you could walk from the city, and you'd go past as like a sort of open air shopping mall, over the bridge next to the railway bridge and past the cathedral, which they left undamaged during the Second World War as a siting for going in bombing other cities. And it was a pointer because it was such a building. It's be like Hereford Cathedral or Salisbury or whatever. Anyway, as we are walking to the exhibition centre on this day, there was a stunning camera shop doing the Leicas, all the high-end stuff. And out of the place came Riefenstahl, Helena Riefenstahl, who was Hitler's photographer during the war. And it's fascinating because I've watched over the years they tried to pin her to the wall to interview her. Channel 4 did masses of stuff on her, trying to get her to admit she knew about the horrors within the Nazi regime. And she never broke rank, but she must have had some insight. She was very close to Hitler, and being a Jewess as well, it's just the weirdest of things. Riefenstahl, Leni Riefenstahl, that's it. And she'd been in to buy a Leica or something in this shop in the early 60s. And it was just one of those historic moments, It's almost like, where were you when Mr. Kennedy was shot and all that sort of stuff that sort of brings... Yeah, but I don't remember what the photokina was like at all. The white wine was very good, I seem to remember.
Well, tell us about the trips to London in the back of the Merc.
Well, Derek was a member of the Royal Photographic Society, and he did engage brilliantly in it, because at that time, to be a member was quite it was quite an accolade. And for a guy who ran a press agency in Hereford, I presume that most of the people would, be based in London or in Paris and whatever. And so anyway, he went out. I do believe he eventually was the president of the Royal Photographic Society. And just as an aside, and I love asides, the offices of the Royal Photographic, I'm pretty sure, became the Iran embassy, of which we all know about the siege and its connection with Hereford as well, because I think the SAS went in and shot a few people. Anyway, we get taken up to London, Mike and I, sitting in the back of the brand new Merc. We always had a brand new Merc. It always seemed brand new anyway. It always smelt of leather. And it was a very comfortable ride. There was no motorways really up to London in those days, and we'd do the journey up through the Cotswolds and off we'd go. And so we'd sit up and we'd end up going in, parking up in, I think the meetings would begin at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They were never very long. So we'd all park the car up and then go to Kettner's, which was quite a reasonable eatery in those days, in Soho Square, just off Soho Square. And as we went in, we were pretty sort of shambolic, Mike and I. We probably wouldn't have worn a suit ever. So we were offered a tie as we walked in, and would Sir like a razor? So, and then we'd have dinner or lunch. And Derek would then, Mike and I would go and have a drink somewhere, and Derek would go off to the meetings, and then we'd arrange to meet up again. We'd probably get a cab back to the Royal Photographic Society headquarters, which is on the way out of town to get back to Hereford, and then we'd drive through. And then Evans would be on and off the bloody clutch like mad, and we'd all be, Mike and I'd be feeling very sick by the time we got back to Hereford. But they were enjoyable days out.
I'm sure there's lots you're not telling us, Rik.
Yeah, no, probably. There were no sick bags in the back of his car.
What about the Hasselblad story, that he bought that?
Yeah, well, your colleagues seemed to think that wasn't right, but I'm pretty sure it was. There was the, Derek took on new technology like a duck to water. He loved it. He loved all that new technology. And the first thing I remember was when we were doing more and more filming for sport and for newsreels. And the saga would be, if you could get to it and film it, you could definitely sell it. You know, it could just be a pretty minor accident, but it might be quite important because the person who'd had the accident might be a notable person. And so I remember he had a couple of Bolex, 16mm Bolex, but he saw an advert for an ST Arriflex, which was state-of-the-art German, designed for filming the German Olympics, actually. A beautiful thing. I've used one for years and years and years. And anyway, we went up to London and we were shown this camera and all the bits. It was all laid out in this photography shop in London. And I'd read somewhere, maybe in one of the heavy newspapers, that a camera had survived. It might have been a technical journal, because I suspect that Arriflex would have latched on to the story that this camera had fallen down a mountainside and it was actually Everest. And the camera had survived within the steel box that it had been with. And so we saw that. We never got to see the box, so we only ever presumed that the camera that we ended up in the office was in fact the one that got disappeared on Everest, and eventually someone found it. And then moving on with his technical yearning to be at the top, he was doing masses of colour photography at the time where many people weren't doing it. They were doing black and white still. Anyway, I remember his yearning to buy as the super wide Hasselblad, and he went off and bought that. I think that was up in town or somewhere, and he'd just got one picture in his mind at that stage he was going to use it for, and that was for, I'm pretty sure it was when they moved the big black and white property in the middle of the town square, and they moved it so many feet. Anyway, he photographed it being, the story was better than the actual moving, because it was a really slow procedure, I think. And anyway, he got it published masses of places. So yet again he was there, and his caption was probably quite good.
What was it like in Hereford in those days? And I wonder if you could maybe move on to talk about the Scaries.
Okay, yeah. Okay. My family lived in Worcester, and for probably a year, maybe just over a year, I travelled in and out of Hereford by train, early morning and late afternoon back to Worcester. So the nightlife I never got to see unless I was working late. And then a lovely couple of young women I used to know drove down in a Morris Traveller, and their dad used to give them a fiver to come and collect me in Hereford. We'd then go to the Spread Eagle for a steak for the three of us on a fiver, and then drive back to Worcester. But Hereford was a quiet market town. I mean, I've driven around it many times since I've left, and I am really confused by the road thing, but I've found some of the back routes. You could get in and out of Hereford quite quickly, and it was such a quiet place. But even during the day, it was never chaotic and traffic. I mean, I know every city in the world's become that fuller with traffic and whatever. When Mike and I weren't up to whizzing round the countryside or in the town or other towns, photographing or filming, we'd whiz round the corner to Ascaris from the office, and Mike had been a regular visitor. I think even when he was on the tools with the gas board, he was one of his haunts. He had a bubble car. I don't know whether he had one of those Messerschmitt bubble cars, and so he'd park it. Well, he probably wouldn't even park it. He'd just abandon it in the street somewhere, and so he'd go in there. And I know in the early days of him working for Evans, the Beatles, loads of other rock people, bands, stars, entertainers were there, and Mike got to photograph them and exist with them, learn what they were going to do, and he was at the back of his soul, he was a thespian. Mike, he wanted to be in the theatre, and he loved all that. He'd change his voice, he'd change his clothing, and he was part of amateur dramatics, so he had a complete other character apart from when he was on the road photographing people. So he could relate to all these, so-called, I'd hate it, stars. Get rid of Hello Magazine and we'd be all right. So anyway, so he'd get to know, and then eventually I'd get taken along as well to the coffee bar, and it was good. It was really brilliant, because the family were part of Ascari, the Italian racing driver, as you would be if your name was Ascari, and he was very famous in his day. But no, Mike got to know good characters, and he had a lot of local knowledge, and a load of mates, younger mates that he'd worked with, would obviously give him stories, and he did a lot of theatre stuff. So he had, whereas I wouldn't have the local knowledge as Michael did. And then it was a sad day when he whizzed off to Cheltenham, and Uncle Keith arrived.
Do you remember a certain John Bulmer as well?
I think John and I were like ships in the...
Sorry, Mike,
yeah,
can you say John Bulmer?
yeah, can.
Sorry, why do you
Doesn't matter. It's my hair. It's my hair. John Bulmer. There were lots of characters that passed, and I've only just learnt that the woman before Mike was Jeremy Bowen's mother. I can't believe that. I never worked with Jeremy, who's a brilliant journalist in a war zone. Lives in a war zone, doesn't he? Basically, but John Bulmer was busy with, I don't think he ever worked into Derek. They were good contacts. They liked each other. They were in a completely different world. John would go off for months on end to do 2 massive photojournalism stuff for the Sunday Times colour supplement when Hunter Davis was picture editor. But they had a sneaking respect. And I remember one day Bulmer coming into the office. I think it was the only day I possibly ever met him. And he's going, on the expenses, prostitute. Only time a photographer will be allowed to claim for a prostitute on the expenses. been photographing them in where it was, Thailand or somewhere. So he got, Derek's going, really? So we all laughed. And I'm sure John never paid for them otherwise, except with the newspaper's money.
What other characters? Because we've been told that people would just drop into the studio. You'd have.
There was always people clumping up at the office. There were always people clumping up the stairs, and what with the military, the SAS characters, and that, which we had a really good relationship with, albeit at their, they held the rules for that relationship. But there was always characters, good mates of Derek's, and that popping up, and there'd often be people booking their holidays on the ground floor. I think there was a travel agents there, and then they'd whiz up to see Derek. Just booked to go to so and so. I forgot to tell you actually. There was on one occasion Derek was extremely happy with himself, and he went off to a jazz concert in Birmingham, I think it was. And there was a guy. I mean, sadly, I've never been knowledgeable. I love jazz, but I'm not knowledgeable about it. And he was so excited, came to the office the next morning. He said, God, I've got this brilliant picture of this pianist, jazz pianist. And he said, it's spectacular. He never speaks, He comes on the stage, sits at the piano, plays, gets up, bows to the audience, sits back down, plays another number. I don't, would it be Errol Garner? I don't know. Well, I'd have to check that out. But anyway, he was so excited about getting this picture. He rang the record producers, and this guy was putting an LP together, and Evans managed to blag the cover of an LP of this jazz pianist. And I go, there, that's bloody, that's lateral thinking. That's what's it out the box. I mean, he was just like that. He would just see an opportunity and whatever. Would it be Errol Garner? I don't know.
Could be.
Was he a pianist?
Yeah.
But did he speak to people?
I can't remember.
No.
He spoke to Miles Davis, didn't he?
Yeah. Anyway, there were lots of occasions like that where he was so excitable with stuff, and he'd go, I've got to get this off, send these transparencies off to Tom Blau, and the lights being really nice on the daffodils and the young women. And he did lots of what we would call pretty young women pictures, and they were brilliant. And he had a phenomenal market at doing that with this agency run by Tom Blair. I think it was called Camera Press at the time.
So did you ever get pulled into what was being described as the hardy perennials, like the hops and the Fownhope flowerwort?
No, I never ever got to those. I mean, he guarded those with his life, really, because he knew. I don't think even Mike went to things like that. We were left to do, I won't call it the dross, but your regular bread and butter pudding, local newspaper, maybe the Birmingham Post, the Birmingham Evening Mail or whatever it was. And then, if we were lucky, we'd make the nationals or we'd make telly regional news. And then on days where we were seriously lucky on a job, we'd make ITN or the BBC national news. And I think I may have already said it, but if you could get the car started and you got the right kit in the car and you could get to these things, it was almost given that it would get used. I mean, we very rarely shot stuff that never got used. I remember I was selling a picture to the Guardian one day. I was running Mike's office actually. Sorry, this may be irrelevant completely, but it's a brilliant story. Shall I tell you? She's excited. Anyway, when Mike Charity desperately needed a holiday, and he rang me and he said, would you be prepared to take a week out from Evans? I'll rent you a car, and would you come over and run the office? And I'm going, yeah, that'd be brilliant, Mike. I love Cheltenham. I always wanted to freelance in Cheltenham, but Mike had done it as a snapper to begin with, and then telly and whatever. And so I was selling this crappy picture of a bus station or a coach station. It was all about travelling, people going off and all that. And there were all these old coaches in Cheltenham bus station, and I had to film them with lugging their suitcases onto the thing. And so I was selling this picture, or telling the picture at what time it would arrive on the train, when the young woman, because you always ended up transferring the charge, you see, to all these paper offices, and the young woman on the switchboard said, "Excuse me, I've just got an emergency call. Could you just hold on?" So I said, "Yes, of course I can." So she went away, and being a bit of a, my girlfriend calls me a sleuth. As she came back on the line, I said, "Oh, that was an emergency, was it?" She said, "Oh, yes." She said, "It sounds horrible." So I said, "Well, what was it?" She said, I said, "Whereabouts? And what was it?" She said, "There's this most horrible thing happened. And there's a man driving a tank transporter with a tank on it, and it's rolled off and crushed one, if not two cars." So I said, "Whereabouts is that?" I said, "I'm out of interest." So she said, "Oh, it's on such and such a hill out of Cheltenham." So I said, "Oh, I'm in Cheltenham." I said, "I might just go and have a look." Because she realised what I was doing, because I'd asked for this number and she would have got the picture editor's number of the whatever Guardian, I think it was. So I said, "Oh, thank you very much. You've been so kind. Thank you." So I grabbed 2 film cameras, and there was a guy called John Stanley was working for Mike as a dreadful apprentice. He was nowhere near as good as Mike or I. He's went on to much better things. And he and I went. Well, I'd shot 2 films before he'd got 12 pictures knocked off on the Rolleiflex, and it was a horrific sight. And you have to tread carefully with stuff like that. I mean, you know when to not cross the barrier of decency or indecency. And so, and Mike was rather thrilled when he came back. I'd done like 2-3 television channels and all the newspapers with John's stuff when he eventually took them. So that was just one of those crazy, I'll just chance my arm and ask, you know. And I think that's what the photojournalism and the press agents is about. I mean, they're much more like dogs these days. With, you know, when they get the teeth in, they'll have a go at everybody, won't they?
It's interesting you said before that when I was working for a paper, we had to constantly on the phone to fire service or the police getting a story. Then you go through to their PR department, so you just couldn't get a bloody answer.
No.
But you were saying that the fire station called you.
Well,
so did you have a host of contacts?
I think we did, and it might not have been the fire station, but it would have been someone in the know. And you just make your contacts, don't you? I mean, when I was working mainly for the BBC in Bristol, I'd receive a brown envelope with a lot of pound notes in it every year from the accounting department or from the news editor of television news, saying, "Thank you, Rick, for all your hard work. You'll probably want to give some of your contacts some money for Christmas and buy them a drink." And he said, "You'll probably want to keep some of it as well." So you used to say, "Thank you very much." Never happens now. This is a long time ago. But you'd pay, you wouldn't bribe them, but you'd buy them a drink or you'd sit with them. And I remember getting a parking ticket in Bristol by the Magistrates Court, and there's some pretty, actually it was, I can't remember his name, Cannon, I think it was, the gold blagger, the guy who robbed the big, off Heathrow Airport, they robbed a big bullion store, and they reckon they got away with 7 million. There'd been a lot of repercussions since. But anyway, he was coming into court, and occasionally he'd have a thrash out at you, or he'd be nice to you. So you took your chances and either got close or stood back. When I went back to the car, there's a traffic warden parked by the car, and I'm going, "Oh," and he said, "Is this yours?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "It's new, isn't it? Your other one was white." And they would not put a ticket on because they knew you. And I'm going, "Oh, put the ticket on, don't worry. The number that you've saved me has been brilliant. Oh, by the way, have you had your party for the traffic warden yet?" And I opened the boot of the car and I'd collected all my Christmas booze. So I'd pull a bottle of port out and give him a bottle of port. "Could you put that on the table for the lads when you see it?" He said, "You don't do it anymore." My career, which has been quite long, I started in 60 and I didn't finish till I was 72. So it's gone on a bit. 1960, that is, not when I was 60. But the grounding at Young Evans is establishment was just brilliant. The cross-section of the work that we got to do, we learned how to print in a hurry. We did all... Yeah, Evans was forever printing exhibition pictures. He was always having exhibitions either in London or wherever. So you helped him do that. Mike would be coming in going, can you give us a hand with this? You know, make up the chemicals, do this, do that. So the grounding in from glass plates and not brass and mahogany, but Linoff cameras into 16mm film, Rolleiflex 2 1/4 square, Leicas, whatever. You know, you won't get that grounding anymore because the digital thing is all encompassing. And it's a one-off. And okay, the camera may change its dimensions, its shape, whatever, and the digital thing will just get more and more and more of it. But the grounding of all of that and meeting the people and respecting people and working alongside Mike and Derek, you know, gives you just the most amazing grounding for, as I've done, travel the world at other people's expense, which is lovely. And I love it. I now... I'm bored with sitting on a plane where there's no empty seat. We do city breaks to all the stunning cities around the world, but I'll never ever do long haul ever again. When I was doing long haul, you had a seat for the camera and I had another seat by the side of you. You could collapse in and go to sleep or something. You'd never get that to happen anymore. Things have changed so much. But I've travelled the world and I never yearned to go to America. I always yearned to go to the East. And I worked Russia masses, went in there with a pile of balloonists from Bristol and started filming them, paid for it out of my own money to go there, took a sound man with me and a photographer and did a lot of material there and learnt to love Russia. We persuaded the Russians to put the gas lights on at the back of Winter Square where the revolution happened and at the back of the Hermitage Museum, which everybody who understands the world would know of. And it took 3 days for them to get permission to put these lights on. And then we had a balloon glow where the balloons are anchored and they, you know, it's just memorable images. And then I worked back in Russia and there's a young man called Putin who was my minder for quite a long time. And he wasn't really my minder. That's a euphemism for he was keeping an eye on what we were up to because he was senior KGB. And we'd ask for, could we get access to the chief of police? Could we interview the mayor? Could we do this? And he just went off and fixed it. But as long as he had control of it, he was happy. So he knew we were up to mischief, but he was quite prepared to let us go so far with the mischief. And one of the most memorable times was interviewing the mayor, who was the most delightful man. And he said, I can give you 20 minutes. So we turned up to film him, interpreter, journalist and a producer, which was a big crew in that for me. Normally I worked with a journalist or a producer, and there were just two of us. And he said, look, I'll tell you what, you go into my office, which was so grand, and I'll sit in this room out here and he was meeting bankers from all over the world to do business with him in St. Peter, well, it was Leningrad and then St. Petersburg. So we went in and I'm setting up the microphones. There's noise over everything. And, you know, because I was by then one-man banding. And so I thought, oh, God, this is the pain. So I put out radio mics. So, oh, they're fine. So he came in. We were with him for 2.5 hours, this man. We weren't interviewing him the whole time. We did about 2 45-minute tapes, I suppose, or something. He was the most delightful man. And I showed him that I'd turned the camera off because some of the stuff he was talking about was like a bit controversial. And so I turned the camera away, but I still had the headphones on. And so I had one ear off and one on listening to. All of a sudden there's this unbelievable noise over the headphones. I thought, oh, one of my radio mics, batteries are packed up or something. So anyway, no. So I switched the radio mic down. It was the other one. And so I looked out of the window. There's a 15-ton truck outside with a big dish on it, just like in the Second World War. And they tracked down the fact our radio mics, and they'd been listening to the whole interview. So just shows you.
question really. You know, the recording stories like yours,
Yeah.
the value in it, because the whole project is based around Derek Evans' archive.
Sure.
Why it should be done?
Why is it important?
Why
Well,
is it important?
it's heritage, isn't it? I'm in the wrong period of life and the wrong generations. I would love to have been born in the Georgian period because I just love it. I'd love to have been around when the Egyptians built all those amazing places. But we learn about those in history. And I think you have to, I mean, nobody will bother making a film about me because Evans he's what I call an icon, you know. And in his own right, and he built up a brilliant business. He pushed 3 rascals, if not more, out into the world to go and carry on his work. So evaluating the benefits of what he's done, you know, he worked in quite a tight circle, although he went outside it quite often. And I think he ended up outside of Buckingham Palace for some big American magazine. It could have been Time Life. It could have been not Discovery, the major stuff that John was working for. What do you call it? Yeah, I think Derek ended up in '62, whenever it was the coronation, being commissioned by National Geographic to do a series of pictures of the royal, you know, Queen Elizabeth being crowned and all that sort of stuff. So I know he'd done that, and he lived on the royalties of that for a little bit. I know that was a brilliant. It was a beginning of his colour influence. I'm pretty sure it was, but he was never a boasting man, which was brilliant in a way. I mean, he was obviously very proud of what he'd got up to in his own mind, and we were, you know, I don't think we were proud, but we understood the importance of what he was doing for Hereford and, in fact, in England, Britain. I don't know whether he travelled much outside of England. I think he potted to France a few times or whatever. But no, I think you have to, you know, you have to glean as much information as you can about people if they've left a stamp behind them. And too many times I've said to journalists, we should go back to Romania, we should go back to Africa and finish off that story we started. But I'm really sad about it because now, and one of the reasons I packed up, was the fact that they do a story today, they move on tomorrow to do another story, and that story's forgotten. I still visit people I filmed with 30 years ago. I never knew them till I'd filmed with them. And I still go and see them. I made a bit of a film out in Gibraltar about a naval chap being murdered, probably. Never found a body. His family came out to try and persuade people to, you know, come up with an answer of what happened. They come to my house for special parties when we have 100-odd people arrive. And they're lovely people. They're real. They're not like the animals my mates sit not talking to. I just love, you know, the human interaction, and you can't beat it because people. It's tangible, isn't it? People. It's like a piece of furniture. I wanted to make a film about this Great Whitley Court, where there were 2 major fires, and on the night of the fire, they got all the servants, all the people who were employed on the estate, of which there were many, to move all the artworks out, move all the furniture out. And by the next morning, quite a few of those things had disappeared. And I always wanted to go back and see if any of them were still in the village. No way would they ever allow me to. But it's like following up with stuff, isn't it? You know, you want to go back, you want to see what's happened. Did we really tell the true story at the time? Did we help, like with the Romanian children in the old castle? Well, we did at the time. We got a school built, not us, but we prompted people to give money to build a school through Mencap International. I mean, all those things are reasonably important.
Can I just one more question?
Go on.
Do you think Derek was proud of you and Mike and Keith and Jennifer and what you went on to achieve?
It would not be very nice to say. Derek probably, and begrudgingly is not the right word, but I'm sure he was pleased with us rascals he'd put out to work once we'd been through his training school. We Mike was a rascal. He did his own thing. He was brilliant at what he did. Television was not his forte, but he did it to keep the business going. But he was a proper photojournalist, and sadly for him, all the colour supplements and that are just rubbish these days, and they don't contain any good photojournalism in my mind. But Mike was at the cutting edge of all of that. He went off his own bat to Churchill's funeral. He'd go to a Beatles concert, and he'd do his own pictures, and he'd be looking outside the box, which is what we all learnt to do. And I think he would be pleased. He probably never quite understood what I got up to, because television he enjoyed being on the edge of that new stuff, and we used to go and play cricket against some of the television teams, the journalists and snappers from Hereford. But he enjoyed all that. He did enjoy meeting up with famous people, which he got to do quite a bit. That's not my bag.